My dad asked me for $50,000 for a party on the night he forgot I turned 33. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, just the timing of it. The kind of timing that strips everything down to what is actually true. There are moments where clarity does not arrive slowly. It arrives all at once, like a lock turning. The pattern clicks into place, and suddenly you can see every piece of it, where it started, how long it ran, why it kept working. Standing there in that lobby, I felt exactly that. I was in the lobby of the Fairmont San Francisco, 8:47 in the evening on a Tuesday. Marble floors, polished to the point where you could see your reflection if you looked down long enough. Soft piano music drifting from somewhere behind the bar, the kind of place where people speak quietly and everything smells faintly like citrus and money. I had a folder in my hand, black leather. Inside it, a deal I had been working on for 8 months. $48 million on the table. Final negotiations scheduled to start in less than 20 minutes. 3 people were already upstairs waiting for me. One of them had flown in from Boston that morning. The other had canceled 2 other meetings just to be there. I remember thinking I should probably check my phone one last time before going up, just in case. That was when I saw it. No missed calls, no messages, nothing. Not from my mom, not from my dad, not from Sienna, 33 years old, and the only notifications I had were promotional emails and a reminder from my dentist. I stood there for a second, phone in my hand, and I actually had to think about it, like I was solving a problem. Did I get the date wrong? No, it was correct. So I did something I had not done in years. I reached out first. I typed a message to my mom. Short, simple. Thanks for the birthday wishes. I stared at it for a moment, then I hit send. The little blue bubble appeared. Delivered. I slipped the phone back into my bag, took a breath, adjusted the sleeve of my blazer. There was a faint crease near the wrist. I smoothed it out with my thumb, almost automatically. Old habit. Fix the small things, ignore the bigger ones. I was about to head toward the elevators when my phone buzzed. I pulled it out, expecting maybe a quick apology, something casual, something easy to brush off. It was my dad, not a message, a call. I hesitated for half a second, then I answered. Hey, no greeting on his end. No pause. No, how are you? We need 50,000 for the anniversary party. Your mom said you should be able to help. It is this Saturday. Make sure it is wired by Friday. I stood there, still, completely still. He kept going. We have a lot of people coming. Important people. This is not something we can cut corners on, you understand. I opened my mouth, closed it again. Of all the things I expected to hear that night, this was not even on the list. I said quietly, I did not know there was a party. He let out a short breath, like I was already making things difficult. We told Sienna. She probably forgot to mention it. Anyway, that is not the point. The point is, we need the money. You should be useful for once. There it was. Be useful. Not help. Not support. Not contribute. Useful. Like a tool. Something you take out when you need it, then put away when you are done. I looked up at the chandelier above the lobby, crystal pieces catching the light, scattering it in 100 different directions. For a second, I focused on that instead of what I was hearing. My hands were not shaking. That surprised me. I asked, is that why you called? He sounded impatient now. What do you mean? I mean, is that the only reason you called? A pause. Not long, just long enough. We are all busy, Elena. You know that. Do not make this into something it is not. I almost smiled. Something it is not. I said, you forgot my birthday. Another pause, slightly longer this time. Oh, that was today. He said it like he was remembering a meeting he missed, or a bill he forgot to pay. We will celebrate when we see you this weekend. Just make sure the transfer is done before then, and wear something appropriate. Your mom might need you to help with a few things. Help, of course. Serve drinks, set up tables. Smile politely, be useful. I shifted the folder in my hand. The leather felt cool against my palm. Upstairs, 3 people were waiting for me to finalize a deal that would move millions of dollars. Down here, my own dad was asking me for money like I was an afterthought. I said no. It came out calm, flat. almost gentle. He did not respond right away. I could hear something in the background. Voices. Maybe my mom. Music. What do you mean no? I mean I'm not sending you 50,000. His tone changed, sharper now. Excuse me, I am not sending you money for a party. A longer silence this time. Elena, do not start this. This is not about you. I let out a small breath, not a sigh, just air leaving my lungs. It never was. I said, I have a meeting in a few minutes. That is all you have to say. Yes. Another beat. Fine. We will talk about this later. I did not argue. I did not explain. I did not try to make him understand. I said, we will not. And then I hung up. I stood there for a second, phone still in my hand. I did not feel dramatic. I did not feel angry in the way people expect. It was something quieter, clear, like a decision that had been forming for years finally settling into place. My phone buzzed again, a message this time. From my mom. Oh, honey, was that today? We have been so busy planning everything, you understand. We will celebrate soon. No apology, no question, just an explanation, followed by a heart. I looked at the message, read it twice, maybe 3 times. Then I locked my phone. I went into my contacts, scrolled, found both of their numbers, and I blocked them. Just like that. No announcement, no warning, no long speech about boundaries or respect. I just removed access. It felt quiet. I slipped the phone back into my bag, adjusted my jacket again, picked up the folder. For a second, I caught my reflection in the glass panel near the elevators. I looked the same. That was the strange part. Nothing on the outside had changed. Same hair, same suit, same expression. But something underneath had shifted. Permanently. I pressed the button. The elevator arrived almost immediately. The doors slid open with a soft chime. Inside, it was empty. I stepped in, pressed the button for the 22nd floor. As the doors closed, I exhaled slowly. I should have felt something bigger. Anger, hurt, maybe even relief. Instead, I felt focused, like everything unnecessary had just been stripped away. The elevator moved smoothly upward, no jerks, no noise, just a steady climb. I thought about the deal, the numbers, the structure, the concessions we were willing to make and the ones we were not. I thought about the people upstairs, what they needed, what they were expecting. I did not think about my dad, or my mom, or the party. Not anymore. The doors opened. A woman in a navy suit was waiting in the hallway. She smiled when she saw me. There you are. We were starting to wonder if you got lost. I returned the smile, small, controlled. I am exactly where I need to be. She laughed lightly, stepping aside to let me pass. Good. They are all inside. I walked down the hallway, carpet soft under my heels, the low hum of conversation growing louder as I approached the conference room. I paused just outside the door for a second, then I pushed it open. 3 people looked up. One of them stood immediately, extending his hand. Elena, thank you for making the time. I shook his hand, firm and steady. Of course. I took my seat, placed the folder on the table, opened it with practiced ease. The room settled. Pens clicked, papers shifted, eyes focused. This was my world. Clear expectations, defined outcomes, numbers that added up. No one here needed me to be useful. They needed me to be good, and I was. I began to speak, and for the next 90 minutes, everything made sense. Numbers lined up, terms were negotiated, risks were identified and contained. Every question had an answer, or at least a path toward one. When one of them pushed back on valuation, I adjusted the structure without hesitation. When another tried to rush the timeline, I slowed the room down with a single sentence. It was clean, precise, predictable in the way that complex things become predictable when you understand them well enough. At one point, the man from Boston leaned back in his chair, studying me for a second longer than necessary. Not skeptical, not dismissive, just assessing. Then he nodded. We can work with this. That was it. That was the moment the deal shifted from possibility to probability. I closed the folder slowly, letting the room settle into that quiet recognition. Not excitement. Not celebration. Just agreement. We will circulate the revised draft tonight, I said. I want everyone to have time to review before we lock anything in. They nodded. Pens were set down, chairs shifted. As we stood, the woman in the navy suit touched my arm lightly. Nice work. I gave a small smile. Thank you. Simple. Direct. No one here needed anything else from me. When I stepped back into the hallway, the noise faded almost immediately. The door closed behind me with a soft click. I stood there for a second, letting the silence settle. Then I reached into my bag for my phone. Still nothing new. No missed calls. No messages. There was one notification I had been ignoring since yesterday. A message from Adrian. We had been working in overlapping spaces for the past few months. His firm on the acquisition side, mine on the structure. Professional. Careful. The kind of dynamic that stays on the surface until it does not. His message was short. How did it go tonight? 3 hours ago, that would have been the easiest thing in the world to answer. I stared at it for a second, then I locked the screen. I should have felt something about the call, some kind of sting, a reminder. Instead, it felt distant, like something that had already happened a long time ago. By the time I got back to my apartment in San Francisco, it was a little past 10. The city had that late night glow, streetlights reflecting off windows, the hum of traffic a few blocks away. I kicked off my heels near the door, dropped my bag on the chair by the window, and stood there for a second. Stillness. No noise except the faint buzz of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a siren. I walked into the bedroom and opened the closet. There was a box on the top shelf, white, slightly dented on one corner. I had been meaning to go through it for months. Tonight felt like the right time. I pulled it down, set it on the bed, and sat beside it. For a second, I just looked at it. Then I opened it. Paper, folders, old notebooks, a few photographs. The past, organized and stored away neatly, like it could be contained that easily. I picked up the first folder. Sienna's name was written on the tab in my handwriting. Of course it was. I let out a small breath, something between a laugh and a sigh. Looking back, I should have seen it earlier. The pattern. The way things always seemed to shift around her. I opened the folder. Inside were documents from a project she had presented years ago. A community development proposal. It had been praised, highlighted, used as an example of her leadership. I remembered the night before that presentation. I had been at the dining table, laptop open, eyes burning from staring at the screen too long. The original numbers she had put together did not make sense. The projections were off. The funding allocation was unrealistic. She had stood behind me, pacing. I do not understand why they are being so difficult about this. I had not looked up. Because the numbers do not work. She had sighed, like I was the one making things complicated. Can you just fix it? Just fix it. Not can you help? Not do you have time? Just fix it. I remember thinking I should say no. I did not. I adjusted the projections, reworked the budget, cleaned up the language so it sounded confident, structured, intentional. By the time I was done, it looked like something she had built from the ground up. The next day, she stood in front of a room full of people and presented it like it was entirely hers. Dad had been there, Mom too. I remember the way he smiled, the way he nodded as she spoke. That is my daughter. He had said it loud enough for everyone to hear. Not wrong, just incomplete. I closed the folder slowly, set it aside, picked up another one. Same handwriting, same structure, different project. This one was from a fundraiser she had organized, or at least that was how it was presented. I flipped through the pages, emails, budget drafts, vendor lists. My notes were everywhere, small adjustments, corrections, suggestions she had asked for at the last minute. Hey, can you take a quick look at this? Hey, I just need a second set of eyes. Hey, you are better with this stuff. Always framed as something small, something quick, something that would not take much time. It always took more time than she said it would. It always mattered more than she admitted. And when it was done, when everything worked, when people praised her organization, her attention to detail, her ability to bring everything together, I stood in the background. I nodded. I smiled. That was what good daughters did. I closed that folder too. My phone buzzed. I glanced at it, already knowing who it was. Sienna. Of course. I let it ring for a second, then picked it up. Her voice was light, casual. Hey. I have been trying to reach you. I leaned back against the headboard, the folder still resting on my lap. I have been busy. Yeah, I figured. She let out a small laugh. So listen, I wanted to check in. We have not talked in a while. Check in. The words sat there for a second. I said, "What do you need?" A pause, short, but noticeable. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what do you need?" Her tone shifted slightly. Still friendly, still soft. But there was something underneath it now. "I do not need anything. I just wanted to see how you are doing." I looked down at the papers in front of me. My handwriting. Her name. "I am doing well." "Good. That is good." She hesitated. "So, are you coming on Saturday?" I had almost forgotten about that. "The party. I have not decided. Mom said she texted you." "She did." Another pause. "You should come. It will be nice. A lot of people are going to be there." "Of course they are. Important people. The kind that matter in our world. The kind who never noticed who was standing quietly behind it." "I will think about it," I said. "Okay. Well, let me know." "And Elena," she stopped. "What? Nothing. Just, it would be good to see you." I did not respond right away. She filled the silence with a small, nervous laugh. "Anyway, I will talk to you later." The call ended. I stared at the phone for a second, then set it down beside me. "It would be good to see you." I almost believed she meant it. Almost. I picked up the last folder in the box. This one was thicker, heavier. Inside were documents from something bigger, a partnership proposal, a deal she had been trying to close with a local organization. I remembered this one clearly, because it had almost failed. She had called me late that night, voice tight, controlled in that way that meant she was close to losing it. "They are pulling out." I do not know what to do. I had asked a few questions, simple ones. What are they concerned about? She had not known. What does the contract say? She had not read it closely. I closed my eyes for a second, pressing my fingers against my temple. Send it to me. I stayed up until 2 in the morning going through it. There were issues, structural ones, gaps that made it easy for the other side to walk away. I fixed what I could, suggested a revised approach, drafted an email she could send that made it sound like she had anticipated the concerns all along. The next day, she called me back. It worked. Of course it did. That night at dinner, she told the story like it had been her instinct, her strategy. Dad had listened, impressed. "That is why you are where you are," he said. "You think ahead." I had been sitting right there. He had not looked at me. I closed the folder. Slowly, carefully. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I stacked the folders together, aligning the edges. For a second, I just sat there, looking at them. Years of small corrections, quiet fixes, invisible support. A pattern so consistent it had become invisible. Not to me, not anymore. I stood up, carrying the stack of folders into the small office area near the kitchen. There was a shredder under the desk. I pulled it out, plugged it in, and fed the first page through. The machine whirred to life, cutting the paper into thin strips. I watched as the words disappeared, line by line, number by number, all the work that had never been mine in the first place. Gone. I fed another page. And another. It took longer than I expected. There was more than I remembered. When I finished, the bin was full. I turned the machine off and stood there for a moment, listening to the silence that followed. No more. No more fixing things for them. I wiped my hands against my pants, more out of habit than necessity. Then I walked back into the bedroom, the empty box still sitting on the bed. I looked at it. Empty. For the first time, it actually felt that way. I sat down slowly, staring at the space where those folders had been. My phone buzzed again. Another message. I did not pick it up right away. I already knew what it would be. I let the phone sit there on the bed for a few seconds, vibrating once, then going still. I did not rush to it. That was new. For most of my life, I would have picked it up immediately, read it, responded, adjusted myself to whatever was being asked. I reached for it anyway, but slower this time. The message was from Sienna. "Just checking in. Let me know if you are okay." I stared at the words. Just checking in. I almost admired it. The way it sounded neutral. Concerned, even. Like nothing had happened. Like the last conversation we had was not a quiet refusal followed by silence. I set the phone back down without replying. Then I lay back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling. For a few minutes, I let myself wonder. Maybe she meant it. Maybe she really was just reaching out. Maybe there was a version of this where things shifted, even slightly. The thought stayed there for a moment. Then it passed, because if that were true, she would have called on my birthday, not 2 days later, not with a message that could mean anything. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, 6:15, still dark outside. I made coffee the same way I always did, measured, precise. 2 scoops, filtered water, exactly the same timing. Small routines that did not change no matter what else did. I sat at the kitchen counter with my laptop open, the screen casting a pale light across the room. Emails were already coming in. Rachel had sent an update at 6:02. Minor revisions to the financial model. A question about one of the risk allocations. I typed a response quickly, clean and direct. Looks good. Adjust the third projection. The rest is fine. Send. Another email from one of the partners in Boston. He wanted confirmation on the timeline. I gave it to him. No hesitation, no uncertainty. That part of my life moved forward exactly as it always had. Clear inputs, clear outputs. No guessing what people meant. No reading between the lines. By 8, I was dressed and out the door. San Francisco was already awake. Traffic building, people moving with purpose. Coffee shops full. I stopped at the same place I always did. Ordered the same drink. The barista recognized me, nodded, started making it before I finished speaking. Small things. Predictable things. I appreciated those more than I used to. At the office, the day moved quickly. Meetings, calls, adjustments to the deal. The numbers were tightening. The margin for error getting smaller. That was the phase I liked the most. When everything mattered. Around 11, my phone buzzed again. I glanced at it. Mom. I let it ring. It went to voicemail. A minute later, a message appeared. Hey, just wanted to check in. We have not heard from you. Hope everything is okay. I read it once, then again. Hope everything is okay. The words were soft, careful, but they felt misplaced, like they had been pulled from a script. I did not respond. I set the phone face down on the desk and went back to the spreadsheet in front of me. Rachel stepped into my office a few minutes later. You have a call in 10. I nodded. How is everything looking? She leaned against the doorframe, flipping through a few pages. Good. Tight. They are going to push back on the timeline, though. They always do. I said it without looking up. She smiled slightly. Yeah, they always do. She hesitated for a second, then added, You good? I looked up then. What do you mean? She shrugged. You have been focused. More than usual. I almost laughed. More than usual. I said, I am fine. She nodded, accepting it. Okay, just checking, just checking. The phrase followed me through the rest of the day. By the time I got home that evening, there were 3 more messages. One from Sienna, one from Mom, one from a number I did not recognize. I did not open any of them right away. I made dinner first, something simple. Pasta, olive oil, garlic, the kind of meal you can cook without thinking. The kitchen filled with the smell of garlic and heat. I moved through it automatically. Chop, stir, wait. For a while, that was enough. After I ate, I sat back down on the couch and picked up my phone. I opened the message from Sienna first. Hey, I called earlier. Just wanted to see how you are doing. Also, quick question about something I'm working on. Call me when you get a chance. There it was. Not just checking in. A question, of course. I opened the next message. Mom again. We are getting everything ready for Saturday. It would really mean a lot if you could be there. Let me know. Mean a lot. I almost believe that one too. The last message was from the unknown number. I opened it. Hi, Elena. This is Kevin from Whitmore Consulting. Sienna mentioned you might be able to help with something. Would appreciate a quick call if you have time. Kevin. I recognize the name. CFO. Or something close to it. I leaned back into the couch, the phone still in my hand. There it was, the pattern. Not concern. Not curiosity. Need. It did not come all at once. It never did. It came in layers. First the soft check-in, then the casual mention of a problem. Then the direct request. I scrolled back to Sienna's message. Quick question about something I am working on. I could almost hear her voice. Light. Easy. Like it was nothing. like it would only take a minute. I set the phone down on the coffee table, face down again. For a second, I just sat there. The room was quiet, the city noise muted behind the windows. I thought about calling back, just to see what it was, just to understand the situation. Old habits do not disappear overnight. They wait, quietly, patiently. I picked up the phone again, opened the email app this time. There was a new message from Sienna. Subject line vague. Something about a proposal. I opened it. The email was longer than her texts, more detailed, more urgent. Though she tried to hide it, she explained the situation in broad terms. A partnership that was not moving forward, concerns from the other side, a deadline approaching. She did not say she needed help. Not directly, but it was there. Between the lines, at the bottom, she wrote, I know you are busy, but if you could take a quick look, I would really appreciate it. Quick look. I stared at the screen. The document was attached. I could open it, scan it, identify the issue in less than 10 minutes, fix it in 20, send back a few notes. The problem would disappear. She would present it. It would work. And everything would continue exactly as it always had. I closed the email. My hands rested on the keyboard for a second. Then I moved the cursor, marked as spam. The message disappeared from my inbox. Just like that. I sat there, staring at the empty space where it had been. My chest felt lighter, not in a dramatic way, not relief, not even satisfaction, just less weight. I closed the laptop, stood up, grabbed my keys. I did not need to stay in that room any longer. The restaurant was a few blocks away. Small, quiet, the kind of place you go when you want to have a conversation that matters. I was meeting a client there, a new one. Someone who had been referred to me through one of the partners. He was already there when I arrived, sitting at a table near the window. He stood when he saw me. Elena. I smiled. Good to meet you. We sat. Ordered drinks, started talking, business first, always. He walked me through his situation, the numbers, the risks, the opportunities. I listened, asked questions, made notes. The conversation flowed easily. No tension, no hesitation. At one point, he leaned back in his chair, studying me. You see things differently. I tilted my head slightly. How so? You do not react to the obvious problems. You go straight to the ones underneath. I smiled just a little. That is usually where the real issues are. He nodded slowly. I could use that. I almost laughed. Of course you could. Everyone could. The difference was, not everyone had access to it anymore. The waiter brought our food. The conversation shifted slightly. Still professional, but easier now. I glanced at my phone once. No new messages. For the first time in a long time, that did not feel like something missing. It felt like space. I set the phone down beside my plate and picked up my fork. Across from me, the conversation continued. Clear. Direct. Honest. I focused on that and left everything else exactly where it was. Except I had not. Not really. Because that night, the one I kept circling back to, the one that still sat quietly under everything else, had not ended at the Fairmont. It had ended at my door. It was a little after 10 when I got home that night. Same as always, same routine. Keys in the bowl by the door, shoes kicked off without thinking, bag set down in the chair by the window. I remember standing there in the dark for a moment before I turned the lights on. Just standing. The apartment was quiet in that way that makes you aware of your own breathing. No television, no music, nothing to fill the space. I should have been thinking about the deal. About next steps, timelines, follow-ups. Instead, I was thinking about the phone call. About the way my dad had said it. So easily, so casually. Be useful for once. I walked into the kitchen, opened the cabinet, then closed it again. I was not hungry. I was not thirsty. I did not really need anything. I moved into the living room and sat down on the couch, still in my work clothes, blazer slightly wrinkled now at the elbows. My phone sat on the table in front of me. Silent. I picked it up once, then put it back down. I told myself I was fine, that I had already made the decision, that there was nothing left to process. Then there was a knock at the door, not loud, not urgent, just there. I froze for a second. No one came by unannounced. Not here, not at this hour. Another knock. I stood up slowly, my body already tense in a way I had not noticed before. I walked toward the door, quiet, measured steps. I did not turn the handle right away. Instead, I looked through the small peephole. Adrian. Of all the people I expected to see that night, he was not on the list. I stepped back instinctively. For a moment, I considered not opening the door, pretending I was not home, letting him leave, dealing with it later. That would have been easier, cleaner, no explanations, no conversations. Another knock, softer this time. He was not in a hurry. That was the first thing I noticed. He was not pounding on the door, not calling out my name, just waiting. I stood there, hand resting lightly against the door, and I felt something unfamiliar. Resistance. Not to him, not exactly, to being seen. Because opening that door meant I would not be able to pretend everything was fine. And I was very good at pretending. I stayed there longer than I probably should have. Then I unlocked the door, opened it just enough to see him clearly. He looked exactly the same as always. Calm. Put together. Jacket slightly rumpled like he had been sitting in a car too long. Hey. His voice was even. No pressure. No assumption. I leaned against the door frame slightly, keeping the door half closed. What are you doing here? He shrugged, one hand in his pocket. I was in the area. That was not true. He was not the kind of person who just happened to be in the area. I almost said that. Instead, I said, "It is late." He nodded. Yeah. A pause. You going to let me in? Not demanding, not pushing, just a question. I hesitated again. I could still say no. I could still close the door and go back to the quiet. But something in his posture stopped me. He was not trying to get in. He was giving me the option. That was different. I stepped back. The door opened wider. He walked in slowly, like he was aware of the space he was entering, like he understood it mattered. He did not look around, did not comment on anything. He just stood there for a second, then set a small paper bag on the counter. I brought food. I looked at it. What is it? Thai. The place you like. I had never told him that directly. He must have remembered from something small, something I said once without thinking. I crossed my arms lightly. I am not really hungry. He nodded. Okay. He did not push it toward me, did not insist, just left it there. Then he moved into the living room and sat down on the edge of a couch, leaving space between us. Not too close, not distant either, just enough. I stayed standing for a second, then walked over and sat on the other side. We did not speak right away. The silence was not uncomfortable. That surprised me. Usually, silence felt like something that needed to be filled, explained, managed. This was different. It just existed. After a minute, he glanced at me. You want to talk? It was not phrased like a demand. I shook my head slightly. Not really. He nodded. Okay. Another pause. Then he said, You want to just sit? I let out a small breath. Yeah. That sounded right. We sat there like that for a while. No conversation, no questions. At some point, he got up, walked into the kitchen, and came back with 2 plates. He opened the bag, divided the food without asking, and set 1 plate in front of me. I looked at it, steam rising. The smell of garlic and basil. I picked up the fork without thinking, took a bite. It was warm. That was enough. We ate in silence for a few minutes. Then he said, You look like you had a day. I almost smiled. That was one way to put it. I set the fork down. My dad called. He did not react immediately, just listened. I waited for a question. He did not ask one. So I kept going. He forgot my birthday. A small shift in his posture. Subtle, but there. And then he asked me for money. I let out a short breath. 50,000. For a party. Adrian leaned back slightly, one arm resting along the back of the couch. He did not interrupt. He did not say anything. That made it easier to keep talking. He told me to be useful. The words hung there for a second. I stared at the plate in front of me, the food half eaten. I thought I would feel worse. I said it quietly, but I do not. I looked up at him. My hands are not shaking. I am not even that angry. That surprised me. He nodded once, like he understood exactly what I meant. Sometimes when something happens enough times, it stops being a shock. It just becomes information. I let out a small laugh. That was it. Information. Not betrayal, not disappointment, just confirmation that this is how it has always been. I leaned back into the couch, letting my head rest against the cushion. There was a moment when he said it that I almost asked if he remembered, if he knew what day it was. I paused. Then I said it did not even cross his mind. Adrian was quiet for a second. Then he said, "That says more about him than it does about you." I looked at him. That was almost exactly what I had told myself earlier. It sounded different coming from someone else, more solid, more real. I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, "I blocked them." He raised an eyebrow slightly. "Both of them." I nodded. "Yeah." Another pause. "How does that feel?" I thought about it. Strange. I expected something bigger, relief, or guilt. Or, I searched for the word. Something. He nodded slowly. "Sometimes the biggest decisions do not feel big when you make them. They feel quiet." I looked down at my hands. That was exactly it. Quiet. For a while, we did not speak again. But the silence had changed. It was not empty anymore. It felt steady. I found myself talking again without planning to. I used to fix things for them. I said it like a statement, not a complaint. He glanced at me. "Fix things? How?" I gestured vaguely. "Work. Projects. Whatever Sienna was doing, I would look at it, adjust things, make sure it worked." I shrugged slightly. No one ever asked me to take credit. I just did it. He tilted his head slightly. "Why?" I thought about that. Because it was easier than watching it fail. The answer came out before I could filter it. And because I thought, eventually, someone would notice. I stopped. That part felt different when I said it out loud. He did not respond right away. He did not say anything like "you should not have," or "they did not deserve that." He just said, "Did they?" I let out a quiet breath. No. It was simple, clear, no room for interpretation. We sat there for a few more minutes. Then I leaned forward, picking up the empty plate. I stood, walked it into the kitchen, and set it in the sink. When I turned back, he was watching me. Not in a way that made me uncomfortable, just present. I walked back over and sat down again, closer this time. Not by much, but enough. For the first time that night, I felt something shift. Not in a dramatic way, just a small adjustment, like a piece settling into place. He did not try to fix it. He did not try to explain it. He just stayed. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. The next few weeks moved differently. Not faster, not slower, just cleaner. I went to work. I came home. I slept. I woke up and did it again. But something had shifted under all of it. A layer I did not realize I had been carrying was gone. I stopped checking my phone first thing in the morning. That was new. For years, I would wake up and immediately scan for messages. Not from clients, not from colleagues, from them. A habit so ingrained I never questioned it. Now, the phone stayed on the nightstand until after coffee. Some mornings, I forgot about it entirely. Work filled the space instead. The deal we had been closing at the Fairmont moved into its final phase. Contracts tightened. Numbers locked in. Every decision carried weight. That was where I was at my best. Rachel stepped into my office one morning, a stack of papers in her hand, her hair still slightly damp from the rain outside. "You are going to like this," she said, dropping the papers onto my desk. I glanced down. Updated projections. Clean. Organized. "You fixed the allocation issue." She gave me a look. "I adjusted it based on what you said." And then I pushed it a little further. I scanned the numbers. It was good. Better than good. "You pushed it in the right direction." She smiled, a little more openly this time. "That is because I know what you are going to say before you say it." I almost laughed. "That was not something I heard at home," I said, careful. "That sounds like you are learning." She shrugged, but there was pride in it. Someone has to. I leaned back slightly in my chair, studying her for a moment. "You have been doing good work." She blinked, surprised for half a second, then nodded. "Thanks." Simple exchange. No build-up. No ceremony. But it landed. Recognition did not have to be complicated. Later that week, I sat across from a client in a glass conference room overlooking Market Street. Traffic below, constant and loud. Inside, quiet. He flipped through the documents slowly, stopping every few pages to look at me. "You anticipated all of this." I tilted my head slightly. "That is the job." He shook his head. "No, most people react. You planned for it." I did not respond right away. Instead, I let the silence sit there for a second. He closed the folder. We are moving forward, just like that. No negotiation, no hesitation. He stood, extended his hand. I shook it, firm and steady. When I stepped out of that building, the air felt different, not lighter, just sharper. I checked my phone out of habit. 2 missed calls. Sienna. 1 message from Mom. I opened Mom's message first. Hey, just checking in. Hope you are not working too hard. I read it once. Then I locked the screen. I did not feel the urge to respond, not even a polite one. That part still surprised me sometimes. The absence of obligation. I slipped the phone back into my bag and kept walking. That was how it started. Not with a big decision, not with a dramatic moment, just small choices. Not answering, not explaining, not stepping in. The invitations came next, indirect at first. A forwarded email from a mutual contact, someone asking if I knew anyone who could help with a project. Something that fell exactly into the kind of work my dad's firm handled. I recognized the name immediately. I knew the value, the potential. I also knew that if I sent that email along, if I made that introduction, it would land exactly where it always had. With me, somewhere in the background, fixing whatever needed fixing. I stared at the email for a moment, then I closed it. No response. Another one came a few days later. This time from someone I had worked with before. A short message. We are looking for a consulting group with experience in this space. Thought of you. Or anyone you recommend. I read it carefully. I knew exactly who I could recommend. I did not. Instead, I replied with a neutral response. Thanked them. Suggested they expand their search. Offered no names. It felt strange at first, like I was holding something back. Then it felt appropriate. For once, I was not managing outcomes that were not mine to manage. Rachel noticed the shift before anyone else. We were walking out of the office late one evening, the sky already dark, the streetlights reflecting off wet pavement. You have been saying no more. I glanced at her. To what? She shrugged. Things. Requests. People trying to pull you into things that are not your responsibility. I thought about that. Yeah, she looked at me sideways. That new. I smiled slightly. It is necessary. She nodded. Fair enough. We stopped at the corner, waiting for the light to change. She added, almost casually, You know they're going to notice. Who? Your family. I let out a quiet breath. Maybe. The light changed. We crossed the street, but not yet. Not in any meaningful way. Because as far as they were concerned, nothing had changed. I was still the same version of myself they had always known. The one who did consulting. The one who was stable. The one who could be called when needed. That was the part that almost amused me. The distance between what they thought and what was actually true. It was not something I had created intentionally. I had never hidden anything. They just never asked. And now I was not offering. The deal closed on a Thursday afternoon. 3:42. I remember the exact time because Rachel looked at the clock right after the final signature came through and said it out loud like she needed to confirm it was real. 3:42. I leaned back in my chair, letting the tension leave my shoulders. It was done. 8 months of work. Finished. The room was quiet for a second, then someone let out a low breath. Another person laughed softly. No celebration. Not really. Just a shift. I closed my laptop slowly. Good work, I said. Rachel nodded, still staring at the screen. You too. I gathered my things, slipped them into my bag, and stood. As I walked out, one of the senior partners caught up with me in the hallway. Elena. I stopped. That was clean. I inclined my head slightly. It needed to be. He studied me for a second. You are going to start getting more direct requests after this. I did not respond, just met his gaze. He smiled faintly. You already are not you. I allowed myself a small smile. I am selective. He nodded. Good. We need more of that. Interesting choice of words. I left it there. When I got home that evening, there was an envelope waiting by the door, not in the mailbox, inside, which meant the building manager had brought it up. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand. Heavy paper, cream-colored, embossed lettering, formal. I did not need to open it to know what it was. I set my bag down, walked into the kitchen, and placed the envelope on the counter. For a few minutes, I ignored it. Changed out of my work clothes, washed my hands, poured a glass of water. Routine. Then I came back and picked it up again. I opened it carefully. Inside was a card. Anniversary celebration, 40 years, Napa Valley, Saturday evening. I read it once, then again. No personal note, no mention of the last conversation, no acknowledgement of anything. Just an invitation, clean, polished, as if nothing had happened. I let out a small breath, of course. I set the card down on the counter and leaned back against it, crossing my arms lightly. For a moment, I just stood there, looking at it. This was how they operated. Not confrontation, not resolution. Reset. Pretend the previous moment never existed and move forward as if everything was fine. I picked up the card again, ran my fingers over the embossed lettering. It would be a big event. Important people, clients, friends. The kind of night where everything looked perfect from the outside. I could already see it. The lights, the music, the conversations. And somewhere in that space, the version of me they expected. Helpful, quiet, in the background. I almost laughed. That version did not exist anymore. I walked into the living room, the card still in my hand, and sat down on the couch. For a second, I considered not going. That would have been the simplest option. No confrontation, no interaction, just absence. But absence had been my strategy for the past few weeks, and it had worked. Too well. Because they still had not noticed. Not really. I looked down at the card again. A slow thought formed. Clear. Steady. If I did not show up, nothing would change. If I did, that was different. I set the card on the table in front of me, not with hesitation, with intention. I was going to go. Not for them. Not to fix anything. Not to be useful. Just to be there, as I was now. The drive to Napa Valley took just under an hour. Long enough for the city to fade behind me and the vineyards to take over, rows of green stretching out in both directions, neat and controlled in a way that always reminded me of spreadsheets. Everything in its place. Everything accounted for. I kept the radio off. No distractions. Just the road, the sound of the engine, and the steady rhythm of my thoughts. I had not told anyone I was coming. Not Mom. Not Sienna. Adrian knew I had been invited. He had not asked if I was going. He had simply said, "Let me know if you want company." I had told him I would go alone. This was something I needed to do without anyone standing beside me. By the time I turned into the long driveway, the sun had already started to set. The sky was shifting into that soft gold that made everything look warmer than it actually was. The house looked exactly the same. Large, immaculate, lit up in a way that made it seem like something out of a magazine. Cars were already lining the driveway, valets moving efficiently, opening doors, directing traffic. I slowed the car as I approached. For a second, I considered parking farther away, walking in quietly, minimizing attention. Old habits. Then I exhaled, steady and deliberate. No. I pulled forward. The valet stepped toward me as I stopped at the front. His eyes flicked briefly over the car, then back to me. "Good evening." I handed him the keys. "Thank you." He nodded, professional, but there was a slight shift in his expression. Recognition of value. Not of me. Of the object I had arrived in. It was enough. I stepped out, smoothing my dress without thinking. Dark. Simple. Structured. Not loud. Not attention-seeking. But not something you would wear to carry trays or clear plates. That distinction mattered. The gravel under my shoes made a soft crunch as I walked toward the entrance. Voices drifted from inside. Laughter. Music. The low hum of a gathering already in motion. For a moment, I paused at the edge of the doorway. Not because I was unsure, because I was aware of where I was, of what this place had always meant, of who I had been the last time I stood here like this. Then I stepped inside. The room was already full. People I recognized. Faces from years of dinners, events, conversations I had half listened to while standing somewhere just out of the main circle. They were dressed the same way they always were. Polished, comfortable, certain of their place. For a few seconds, no one noticed me. That was familiar. Then Mom saw me. She was standing near the center of the room, speaking to someone I did not immediately recognize. When her eyes landed on me, she stopped mid-sentence. Her expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, confusion. She excused herself quickly and walked toward me, her heels clicking against the floor. Elena. My name sounded different coming from her tonight. Slightly sharper. You made it. I inclined my head slightly. You invited me. Her eyes moved over me, taking in the dress, the way I was standing, the fact that I was not carrying anything. Her brows pulled together. Why are you dressed like that? I almost smiled. Like what? She gestured vaguely. Like that. I told you to come early. We still have things that need to be set up. You could have helped. There it was. Right on time. I held her gaze. I am not here to help. A small pause, just long enough. Her expression hardened slightly. What do you mean? I said it simply. I am here as a guest. The words landed between us. For a second, she did not respond. Then she let out a short breath, glancing around as if suddenly aware of the space, the people nearby. Do not start this here. Her voice was lower now, controlled. I did not raise mine. I am not starting anything. That was the truth. I had not come to argue. I had come to stand. Sienna appeared a moment later, weaving through the crowd with a glass in her hand. Elena. She smiled, quick, practiced. You are here. I nodded. I am. Her eyes moved between me and Mom, picking up on the tension immediately. Everything okay? Mom straightened slightly. Of course. She looked back at me. We can talk later. I said nothing. Around us, the room had shifted, subtly, but noticeably. A few people had turned their heads. Conversations had slowed, just enough. Attention, not directed, not openly, but present. I stepped past them, not away, through. That was different too. I did not stop to greet anyone immediately. Did not wait to be introduced. I moved toward the bar at the far side of the room, aware of the space opening slightly as I walked. Not dramatically, just enough. The bartender glanced up. What can I get you? Water. He nodded, turning to pour it. As I waited, I felt it. The shift. People were looking. Not in the way they used to. Not dismissive. Not overlooking. Assessing. I picked up the glass when he handed it to me. Thank you. I turned slightly, leaning against the edge of the bar, taking a small sip. Across the room, I saw Dad. He was standing with a group of men near the windows, his posture exactly the same as it had always been. Straight. Controlled. Comfortable in the center of things. He had not seen me yet. Or if he had not reacted. That tracked. I set the glass down, and that was when someone approached. Elena. The voice was familiar. I turned. A man in his early 60s, well-dressed, composed in that effortless way that comes with years of being in rooms like this. We had met before, at least once. I remembered the conversation, brief, professional. You probably do not remember me, he said. I do. He smiled. Good. He extended his hand. I shook it. Firm. Steady. I've been following your work. I tilted my head slightly. Have you? He nodded. That last deal. Impressive. I did not react immediately. Instead, I let the silence sit for a second. Thank you. He glanced past me then, toward the group where Dad was standing. Then back at me. You must be proud. The words were directed at me, but they carried, because he said them just loud enough. Dad turned. His gaze landed on us, on me. For a moment, everything else seemed to fade. The conversations, the music, just that line of sight. The man continued, still looking at me. Not many people could have pulled that off. I said nothing. There was nothing to add. He nodded once, then stepped away, leaving the words hanging in the air. I turned slightly. Dad was walking toward us now, measured steps, controlled. He stopped a few feet away. Elena. His voice was neutral. You are here. I met his gaze. I am. A pause. He glanced briefly at the space around us, the people who were no longer pretending not to listen, then back at me. We should talk. Not now. I said it calmly. Flat. His jaw tightened slightly. This is not the place. I took a small sip of water. It is exactly the place. Another pause, longer this time. For the first time I saw it. Not confusion, not annoyance, uncertainty. Small, controlled, but there. Around us, the room continued to shift. People watching, not openly, but enough. I set the glass down. I am going to walk around. I said it like a statement, not a request. He did not respond. I stepped past him. Again, not avoiding, not rushing, just moving. The room felt different now. The air heavier. charged. I could feel the attention following me, not all of it, just enough. I moved through the space slowly, taking in details I had never really seen before. The way the tables were arranged, the lighting, the small touches Mom had added to make everything look perfect. It was all the same, but I was not. That was the difference. For years, I had moved through this space as someone who did not belong at the center, someone who existed at the edges. Tonight, I stood exactly where I chose to stand. No one had placed me there. No one had asked me to step back. That part was over. And as I looked around, I realized something quietly, without any need to say it out loud. They had not changed. Not really, but I had, and that was enough. I had barely taken a few more steps when I heard it. So what are you working on these days? Mom's voice. Light, casual, almost practiced. I stopped. Not because I had to, because I recognized the pattern. I turned slowly. She was standing a few feet away, Sienna beside her, both of them watching me with that familiar expression. Polite interest, surface level curiosity. The kind that filled space but never really went anywhere. I almost answered the way I always had. Still consulting. Short, easy. End of conversation. That would have been enough for them. It always had been. Instead, I said nothing. For a second. Just long enough for the silence to stretch slightly. Mom tilted her head. Elena. I met her gaze. Yes, she smiled, but it did not quite reach her eyes. I asked what you were working on. I knew that. I let out a small breath. A few things. The answer came out evenly, controlled. Sienna stepped in before Mom could say anything else. Still doing consulting. Her tone was light, almost dismissive, like she was helping fill in the blanks. I turned my head slightly toward her. Yes. A pause. Then I added, I consult on acquisitions. The words were simple, but they landed differently. Mom frowned slightly. Acquisitions. Corporate. Mergers. I watched the recognition try to form and then stall. She nodded slowly, like she understood, even though she did not. That sounds busy. It was almost a question. It is. Sienna gave a small laugh. You always were good with numbers. There it was. Reduction. Simplification. I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger. Clarity. I said, I closed a deal last week. Mom's eyes flickered slightly. Oh, that is nice. Nice. The word hung there for a second. One of the guests nearby shifted slightly, turning just enough to listen without making it obvious. I continued. 48 million. This time, the pause was longer. Not just from them. From the space around us. Sienna blinked. What? The deal. 48 million. I said it the same way I would say any number. Without emphasis. Without performance. Mom let out a small breath. That is, quite a lot. I nodded once. It is. Sienna crossed her arms lightly, studying me. You were part of that. There was a slight edge to it, subtle, but there. I met her gaze. I let it. The words were quiet, but they did not need to be loud. Another silence. Longer now. I could feel it shift outward. People were not pretending anymore. They were listening. Not openly, but enough. Mom's smile tightened. You never mentioned that. I almost laughed. Not out loud, just internally. You never asked. The words came out before I could soften them. They were not sharp. Not aggressive, just true. Mom blinked. What do you mean? I held her gaze. You ask if I am still consulting. I say yes. That is usually where it ends. A small pause. You never ask what that means. Sienna shifted slightly beside her. We ask. Her tone was defensive now. I turned to her. No. I did not raise my voice. You check in, you assume, you fill in the rest. The words felt different as I said them. Like I was hearing them at the same time they were leaving my mouth. For a second, no one responded. I could see it. The recalibration, the way they were trying to adjust to something that did not fit the version of me they had stored away. Mom spoke again, carefully. Well, you never really shared. There it was. I nodded slowly. You are right. That seemed to relieve her slightly. Then I added, because every time I tried, I got interrupted. The memory came back immediately. Uninvited, clear, sitting at the dinner table, trying to explain a project, Dad cutting in halfway through. That is not really your area. Sienna jumping in with something else. The conversation moving on before I could finish the sentence. I blinked once. Back in the present, I continued. Or redirected. Or simplified. My voice stayed even. like I was listing facts. Sienna opened her mouth, then closed it again. Mom glanced around briefly, aware now of the attention. This is not the time. Her voice was lower, controlled. I almost smiled. It is exactly the time, in words as before. But they carried more weight now, because the room had shifted. I could feel it, not all eyes on us, but enough. A man I recognized from earlier stood a few feet away, pretending to study something on his phone. He was listening. Dad stepped closer, close enough now that I could see the tension in his jaw. That is enough. His voice was quiet, but firm. I turned to him, met his gaze directly. For the first time that night, there was no hesitation in me, no instinct to soften, to step back. I said, "You asked what I do." A pause. "I am telling you." He held my gaze for a moment. Something shifted in his expression, not anger, something older than that. He said quietly, "I always knew you were capable." I waited. That was not an apology. It was a reframe. His voice dropped lower. "You think I did not see it. I saw it. I just thought, if I pushed Sienna forward, gave her the spotlight, she would rise to it. You never needed that. You were always going to be fine on your own." The words landed with a particular weight, not because they were cruel, because he believed them, completely. He had not been ignoring me. In his version, he had been sparing me, freeing me from the pressure of expectation by simply trusting I would survive without it. It was the kindest possible explanation for something that had cost me years. And it was wrong in a way I did not have words for yet. I said, "That was not your decision to make." He frowned slightly. "What?" "Whether I needed to be seen, that was not yours to decide for me." Another pause. Longer this time. He held my gaze. Then he said, "This is not appropriate." I tilted my head slightly. What is not appropriate? The conversation, the setting. He gestured subtly around us. Then I looked back at him. "You brought me here." The words were simple, direct. "You asked me to show up." Another pause. "Now I am here." I could see it. The moment where the control shifted. Not completely, but enough. Sienna stepped forward again, her tone sharper now. "You are making this into something it does not need to be." I turned to her. "No." A beat. "I am just answering the question." She let out a short breath. Not quite a laugh. Something frustrated underneath it. "You always did this. Made everything about whether you were getting enough credit." I looked at her. She continued, more quietly now. "I asked you to help because you were good at it. That was a compliment. You could have said no. You never said no." The words sat there. She was not lying. That was the strange part. She had asked. I had never refused. From where she stood, the transaction had been clean, voluntary. A kind of collaboration between sisters where one happened to be better with numbers. She had never needed to ask whether it cost me anything, because I had never shown her that it did. I said, "I know." She blinked, expecting pushback. "You were right that I never said no," I continued. "That was my part of it, a pause. But you also never asked why." The silence that followed was different, heavier, not just tension, recognition. I could feel it settling. For years, I had been part of this room without ever being part of the conversation. Tonight, that was not the case. Mom exhaled slowly. "We can talk about this later." I shook my head slightly. "No, not aggressive, not defiant, just certain. We do not need to talk about it later." I let the words settle, because there is nothing to resolve. Another pause. Then I added quietly, "I am not upset." That part surprised even me. It was true. I am just done explaining. The sentence hung there, not dramatic, not final in the way people expect, but complete. For a second, no one spoke. Then someone behind us cleared their throat lightly, a small sound, but it broke the moment. Conversation started to pick back up, not fully, but enough. The room exhaled. Mom stepped back slightly. Sienna looked away. Dad said nothing. I stood there for another second. Then I reached for the glass of water I had left on the table nearby. Took a small sip. My hands were steady. That still surprised me. I set the glass down. And for the first time in that house, in that room, in front of them, I realized something that had been true for a long time. I did not need them to understand. I turned slightly, ready to step away again. And this time, no one stopped me. I moved toward the edge of the room, away from the center, not hiding, just repositioning. The noise of the party began to fill back in around me. Conversations resumed, laughter returning in careful bursts, like people testing whether it was safe to move again. I picked up another glass of water from the bar. My reflection in the mirror behind it caught my eye for a second. I looked the same. That was the strange part. But the room did not feel the same anymore. Behind me, I heard footsteps. Measured. Familiar. I did not turn right away. I already knew. Adrian. He stopped beside me, not too close, just within the same space. You picked an interesting night to make an entrance. His tone was quiet, almost amused. I took a small sip of water. It seemed like the right time. He nodded once. Yeah, it did. For a moment, we stood there side by side, both looking out at the room instead of at each other. Then he said, "Your dad does not look like he is enjoying himself." I almost smiled. That is new. He glanced at me. "You okay?" I considered the question. Yes, that answer came easily. He studied me for a second, then nodded. Good. There was no follow-up. No need to dig deeper. That was one of the things I had started to notice about him. He did not ask questions to fill silence. He asked them when he actually wanted the answer. A shift in the room caught my attention. People were looking again, not the same way as before. This time, it was directed toward us. I followed their gaze. Dad was approaching. Mom beside him. Sienna just behind. A formation. Familiar. Controlled. I set the glass down. Adrian did not move. He did not step forward. He did not step back. He just stayed where he was. That mattered more than I expected. Dad stopped in front of us. His eyes flicked briefly to Adrian, then back to me. "Who is this?" His tone was neutral, but there was something under it. "Tight." I answered simply. "This is Adrian." A small pause. Adrian extended his hand. Adrian Blackwell. He said it calmly, like it did not carry weight. It did. I saw it register, not just with Dad, with the people nearby. Names meant something in rooms like this. Connections. Position. Dad shook his hand, but his grip was slightly off. Just enough to notice. Blackwell. He repeated it. Yes. Adrian did not elaborate. He did not need to. Mom stepped in quickly, her smile tight. "Well, it is nice to meet you." Her eyes moved between us. "How do you know Elena?" Adrian glanced at me briefly before answering. "We have been seeing each other." The words were simple, but they landed. A shift moved through the space again. Subtle, but real. Sienna's expression changed first, just for a second, then she smoothed it over. "Seeing each other." She repeated it lightly. "For how long?" Adrian did not hesitate. "A few months." I could feel the attention tighten around us. Not just curiosity now. Interest. Calculation. Mom's smile faltered slightly. "You did not mention this." She said it to me. I met her gaze. "You did not ask." The same words. Different context. They landed harder this time. Dad's eyes moved between us again. Blackwell. He said it again like he was testing it. Adrian nodded once. Yes. Dad's jaw tightened slightly. That is, interesting. It was not a compliment. Adrian did not react. He simply said, "We have been working in overlapping spaces." Working. The word hung there. Sienna leaned in slightly. "What kind of work?" Adrian looked at her. "Direct. Strategic acquisitions." The same words I had used earlier. But from him, they carried a different weight. Sienna's expression flickered, just for a second. Then she smiled again. "Of course." Mom glanced at me, then back at him. "And you two met through work." Adrian did not look away. "Yes." Dad let out a short breath. "That explains a lot." It was not clear what he meant, but the tone was. Adrian shifted slightly, turning just enough to face him more directly. "I assume you are Elena's dad." "I am." There was a pause. Adrian held his gaze. "You should be proud." The words echoed the earlier comment, but this time they were deliberate, directed. Dad did not respond immediately. For the first time that night, I saw it clearly. He did not know what to say. Mom stepped in again, her voice sharper now. "We are proud." "Of course we are." Adrian nodded once. Good. He did not push, he did not elaborate, he just let the words sit there. That was enough. Around us, the reactions were harder to ignore now. People were not pretending anymore. They were watching. Not openly, but not hiding it either. The shift had become visible. Sienna crossed her arms slightly. So what exactly do you do? She was asking Adrian, but her eyes flicked to me. Adrian answered calmly. I run acquisitions for Blackwell Group. Another shift, stronger this time. The name carried weight, more than most in that room. Dad's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough. Recognition. And something else, uncertainty. Mom's composure slipped for a second. Blackwell Group. She repeated it, quieter now. Adrian nodded. Yes. Silence. Not empty. Heavy. I could feel it pressing in from all sides. This was not the version of me they knew. This was not the position they had assigned. And now, standing here, they were trying to reconcile something that did not fit. I did not help them. I did not explain. I just stood there. That was new. For a moment, no one spoke. Then a voice from behind us broke through. Adrian. He turned. A man in his late 60s approached, smiling. I did not expect to see you here. Adrian inclined his head slightly. Last-minute decision. The man nodded, then glanced at me. And you must be Elena. I met his gaze. Yes, he smiled. I have heard about you. That phrase again. I have heard about you. It landed differently now, not curiosity. Recognition. Dad heard it too. I saw the shift in his posture. Subtle, but there. The man continued. Impressive work on that Boston deal. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I let the silence sit. Then I said, thank you. He nodded once. Very clean execution. He turned back to Adrian, continuing the conversation. But the damage was already done. Not loud, not dramatic, just visible. Mom's composure slipped further. You never told us any of this. Her voice was lower now, controlled, but strained. I looked at her. You never asked. Again, same words, different weight each time. Dad stepped back slightly, not physically, but in presence, like he was recalibrating, trying to understand something that had already moved past him. And that was when I heard it, not from them, from behind. Two men speaking quietly near the edge of the room. I was not meant to hear it, but I did. Cash flow is tighter than they are letting on. A pause. I know. That last project did not land the way they expected. Another pause. If they do not close something soon. The rest of the sentence trailed off. I did not turn, did not react. But I heard enough. Something is wrong. Not visible on the surface, not part of the image they were presenting, but there, underneath. I filed it away, quietly, carefully, the same way I handled everything else. When I looked back at my family, nothing had changed on the outside. The same expressions, the same posture, the same performance. But now, I knew something they did not think anyone knew. And that changed the balance again. I stepped back slightly. I think we should go. I said it quietly. Adrian glanced at me. A brief pause. Then he nodded. Okay, no questions, no hesitation. We turned, not rushed, not abrupt, just leaving. Behind us, the room continued, the music, the conversations, the image. But something had shifted, not loudly, not yet. As we walked toward the door, I felt it settle. That quiet recognition again. They had not just underestimated me, they had miscalculated everything. And they did not even know it yet. 2 years passed like that. Not in a dramatic blur. Not in a montage of healing and sunshine and perfect closure. Real life is usually less cinematic than people want it to be. It is mostly calendars and airport terminals, work dinners and grocery lists, mornings when you feel fine and afternoons when a memory hits you sideways for no good reason. I kept living. That was the part I think they never expected. I did not circle back. I did not make some grand return to explain myself. I did not send holiday cards or birthday texts or one of those carefully worded messages people send when they want contact without accountability. I just kept going. Work got bigger, cleaner, harder in the right ways. The Boston deal led to another one, then another. By the end of that year, I was no longer just the person people brought in when things got messy. I was the person clients asked for by name. which was satisfying in a way I cannot fully explain. Not because of the status, because of the specificity. There is something deeply healing about being recognized for exactly what you do well. Rachel got promoted. Adrian became the person I called when my flight got delayed in Dallas or when I forgot to eat because I had been staring at a spreadsheet for 6 hours straight. I moved apartments, nothing extravagant, just better light, better windows, a kitchen that did not feel like a punishment. I saw my life more clearly once I stopped looking over my shoulder for their reaction to it. That was the quiet miracle. And from a distance, my family seemed to keep doing what they always did. They hosted. They smiled. They posted photos from fundraisers and charity dinners and wine weekends with people who liked being photographed in expensive outdoor furniture. Sienna stayed visible in the way she always had. Panels, nonprofit luncheons, smiling beside giant checks she had not written. Mom kept curating the image. Dad kept wearing confidence like it was an inherited suit. If you only looked at the surface, they were fine, maybe even thriving. That was the thing about certain families. They could be sinking and still remember to polish the silver. I did hear things now and then. You always do, if you live in the same professional ecosystem long enough. A delayed project here. A client that quietly went elsewhere. A whisper about Whitmore Consulting losing momentum in a sector Dad used to dominate without breaking a sweat. Nothing catastrophic. Not at first. Just hairline fractures. Then, one afternoon in late October, at 4:17, my phone buzzed while I was in the back seat of a town car on my way to SFO. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Instead, I opened the message. Please call me. No name. A minute later, another one. It is important. Then another. Mom is very upset. I stared at the screen for a second, then locked the phone and looked out the window. We were crawling through traffic, gray sky, brake lights, one of those San Francisco afternoons where everything looked slightly tired. My phone buzzed again. Then again. By the time I got to the airport, I had 7 messages from 3 different unknown numbers. No voicemail. Just urgency. I did not answer. At the gate, while waiting to board, I opened them one by one. The first was from Mom. Please do not ignore this. The second was from Sienna. We need to talk. The third was from Dad. Call me. No greeting, no explanation, no acknowledgement of the last 2 years. Just the assumption of access. I almost smiled at that. Some patterns survive longer than they should. I put my phone on airplane mode and boarded. When I landed in Charlotte the next morning for a client meeting, I turned it back on. 23 new messages. By lunch, there were 39. By the time I got back to my hotel that night, there were 51. That was when I stopped thinking of it as communication and started thinking of it as an event. The content changed in stages. At first, it was commanding. Call me now. Where are you? This is ridiculous. Then it became strategic. We just need a conversation. There has been a misunderstanding. You do not have all the facts. Then emotional. Mom is beside herself. Dad is under a lot of stress. Sienna is trying to hold everything together. By the end of the week, it had turned desperate. Please, you have to call. We are running out of time. That phrase got my attention. Running out of time. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed in Charlotte, still in my work clothes, and read that one twice. Then I called no one in my family. I called Marcus Reed. Marcus was a private banker Adrian had introduced me to a year earlier when I was restructuring some investments. Dry, discreet, impossible to rattle. The kind of man who could tell you your house was on fire in the same tone he used to discuss municipal bonds. He answered on the second ring. Elena. Hi, Marcus. Can I ask you something slightly inappropriate? He made a small sound that might have been a laugh. Those are usually the interesting questions. Do you know anything about Whitmore Consulting? A pause. Short. Professional. I know enough to avoid being quoted. That was answer enough to tell me there was something to know. I stood and walked over to the window. Charlotte traffic below, headlights moving through the rain. How bad is it? He was quiet for a moment. Liquidity is tight. I leaned one shoulder against the glass. Tight how? Vendor payments delayed. A line of credit under review. A project that was expected to close did not close. I closed my eyes briefly. The thing I had overheard at the party. The unfinished sentence. If they do not close something soon. Apparently they had not. Marcus continued in the same measured tone. They have been trying to maintain appearances. That gets expensive. I let out a breath. Yes, it does. There was another small pause. You want my honest opinion? I almost laughed. I called you for your charming personality, but sure. This time he did laugh, briefly. They are not collapsing because of one bad quarter. They are collapsing because whoever used to catch the mistakes is no longer catching them. The words landed so cleanly that I did not answer right away. Whoever used to catch the mistakes. He did not know the full family dynamic. He did not need to. Pattern recognition does not always require the whole story. I thanked him, ended the call, and stood there for a while with the phone still in my hand. The messages kept coming. At some point during the next 2 days, the total hit 80, then 94, then 112. I counted because the number itself started to feel surreal. 112 separate attempts to reach me after 2 years of silence. That is a lot of urgency from people who never thought to ask what I actually did for a living. Back in San Francisco, I finally listened to the voicemail Dad had left 3 days earlier. His voice sounded different. Still controlled. Still trying to sound in command. But thinner somehow. Less for a minute. Elena, call me back. This is not the time for pettiness. I stopped the message there. Pettiness, of course. When a boundary inconveniences someone who benefited from your lack of one, they almost always call it cruelty. The next voicemail was from Mom. She was crying, or trying to sound like she had been. With Mom, those were not always the same thing. Honey, please, we need to talk. There have been some setbacks. Setbacks. Such a gentle little word for the kind of thing that keeps bankers awake. The third voicemail was Sienna. She sounded exhausted. Can you just call me, please? I am serious. This is bigger than you think. That one I almost believed. Almost. A week later, Rachel stepped into my office holding a folder and a latte I had not asked for. You look like you are calculating a murder. I glanced up. That obvious. Only to those of us who know you well. She set the coffee down. You want to tell me what is going on? I thought about saying no. Instead, I said, my family is imploding. She considered that for half a second, financially or emotionally. I gave her a flat look. Yes. She sat down across from me without asking. I filled in just enough. The messages, the silence before them, the likely issues underneath. She listened without interrupting, which is how I knew she understood it mattered. When I finished, she leaned back in the chair, and you have not responded. No, she nodded slowly. Good. I blinked once. That was not the reaction I expected. She shrugged. If they only know how to find you when they need something, then this is not a crisis. This is a pattern reaching its logical conclusion. That was Rachel. No unnecessary soft edges. I looked down at the folder on my desk, though I was not really seeing it. It does not feel like revenge. She was quiet for a moment. Maybe it is not. I looked back up. What do you mean? She folded her hands in her lap. Maybe you are not doing anything to them. Maybe you are just not doing it for them anymore. That sat with me, not because it was profound, because it was accurate. Later that night, I opened the messages again and read through them in order. The progression was all there: demand, frustration, guilt, panic. No one ever wrote, we should have treated you better. No one said, we were wrong. Need has a way of making people reveal themselves, but not always in the noble direction. Then one message from Sienna caught my eye because it was the first one that said anything remotely honest. Kevin left. I stared at that. Kevin Doyle. The quiet man who had been at Whitmore Consulting for years, doing the unglamorous work of making sure the numbers actually worked. The CFO does not leave in the middle of a storm unless he knows where the lightning is headed. A few messages later, another line. The bank is not extending anything until year end. There it was. Then, buried farther down, the real one. The Aurora deal fell through and Dad already promised against it. I sat back slowly. That would do it. A failed deal is a disappointment. A failed deal you already spent against is a collapse. My apartment was quiet around me, dishwasher humming softly in the kitchen, city sounds muted behind the glass. I read those 3 messages again. Kevin left. The bank is not extending anything. The deal fell through. The whole structure came into focus in less than a minute. Not because I was brilliant. because I had done this professionally for long enough to recognize when people build a future on money that is not actually in hand. And beneath all of it, under the numbers and timing and pressure, was something much older. The same thing that had followed me through childhood, through dinners, through projects I fixed without credit. They had built a system that depended on someone making the weak parts hold, someone smoothing the edges, catching the mistakes, rewriting the draft no one else read carefully enough, quietly making incompetence look like confidence. They did not lose everything because I attacked them. They lost everything because I stopped volunteering as structural support for a house that was never mine. I sat there in the half light of my living room, phone in my hand, and said it out loud for the first time. I did not destroy them. The words sounded calmer than I expected. I just stopped saving them. And once I heard it, I knew it was true. The meeting happened 3 weeks later. Not at their house, not at mine. A conference room at a small law office in Palo Alto. Neutral ground. Glass walls, long table, the kind of place where people come to talk about things that cannot be avoided anymore. I arrived 5 minutes early. Of course I did. I always did. The receptionist nodded when I walked in, already expecting me. She pointed me toward the room. I thanked her, walked down the hallway, and pushed the door open. They were already there. Mom, Dad, Sienna, sitting on one side of the table like a unit. That part had not changed. There was a fourth person in the room. A woman I did not recognize. Mid-50s. Dark jacket. A notepad in front of her, pen resting beside it at a precise angle. She looked up briefly when I entered, gave a single nod, then looked back down. Not a family member. Not someone there to mediate. A witness. The office's own. The kind of person whose presence meant that whatever was said in this room would be said in front of someone who had no stake in how it landed. I noted that. Filed it away. Good. Mom stood when she saw me. Elena. Her voice broke slightly. I noted it the way I would note a detail in a contract. Observed, not absorbed. I closed the door behind me and took the chair directly across from them. No hug, no hesitation, just distance. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Mom reached for my hand across the table. I did not take it. Her hand hovered there for a second, then slowly pulled back. "We are so glad you came." I nodded once. "You asked to meet." Dad leaned forward, fingers laced together on the table. "We need to have a conversation." I almost smiled. That was familiar. Yes. He cleared his throat slightly. "Things have been difficult." There was a pause, like he expected me to fill it. I did not. Mom stepped in quickly. "We have had some setbacks." Unexpected ones. Setbacks. The same word. Consistent language. I sat back in the chair, hands resting lightly in my lap. "I am aware." They all looked at me. Sienna frowned slightly. "How?" I met her gaze. "I hear things." That was enough. Dad's jaw tightened. "Then you know this is serious." I nodded. "It is." Another pause. He leaned forward slightly more. "Then you understand why we need to fix this." Need. That word again. I said nothing. Mom's voice softened. "We need your help." There it was, not hidden this time. Clear. Direct. I felt something shift in the room. Not tension. Expectation. Like they believed this was the moment the pattern would resume. The moment I would step back into the role they understood. Fix it. Make it work. Be useful. I let the silence stretch. Just long enough. Then I asked, quietly, "What exactly do you need?" Dad exhaled, relieved to finally be moving forward. "We need liquidity, short term. Enough to stabilize until we can close a new deal." Numbers followed. Projected timelines. Plans. I listened, not interrupting, not reacting, the way I would listen to any client laying out a situation, except they were not my clients. When he finished, the room went quiet again. Mom leaned forward. "We would not be asking if we had any other option." I looked at her. "I believe that." She seemed relieved. Then I added, "That does not change my answer." The relief disappeared. Dad's expression hardened. "You have not even heard what we are offering." I tilted my head slightly. "You are offering nothing." The words landed flat. "Accurate." Sienna spoke quickly. "That is not fair." I turned to her. "No." A pause. "It is precise." Dad leaned back slightly, his tone sharpening. "This is not a business negotiation." I met his gaze. Then why are you presenting it like one? Another pause. Longer this time. Mom's voice broke again. We are your family. There it was, the final card. I let the word sit for a second. Then I said quietly, I know. No anger, no resistance, just acknowledgement. And that is why this is simple. Simple, not easy. Simple. I reached into my bag, pulled out an envelope, set it on the table between us. Mom stared at it. What is that? I slid it toward her. Open it. Her hands were shaking slightly as she picked it up. She opened it carefully, pulled out the check. $87,500. She stared at it like it did not make sense. Dad leaned forward, reading the number. His expression shifted. Confusion, then something else. Recognition. I spoke before they could ask. That is what you said it cost. My voice was steady, to raise me. The words settled into the room, heavy, unavoidable. Mom's eyes filled with tears. Elena, I held up a hand slightly, not to stop her, just to mark the boundary. I am paying it back. The silence that followed was absolute. No movement, no sound. Sienna looked between us, trying to understand. Dad's voice came out lower. What are you saying? I met his gaze directly. We are even. There it was. Clear. Complete. No room for interpretation. Mom shook her head quickly. No. That is not how this works. I nodded slightly. It is now. Her voice broke fully this time. You cannot reduce this to money. I almost smiled. You did. That landed harder than anything else I had said, because it was true. Dad's face tightened. This is not acceptable. I leaned back slightly in the chair. You do not have to accept it. Another pause. But you will understand it. Sienna spoke again, her voice sharper now. So that is it. You just walk away. I looked at her. I already did. That part was not new. This was just the documentation. The room went quiet again. I could feel it, not just the tension, the shift. The moment where the old structure no longer held. Mom whispered, "This is not what family does." I thought about that for a second. Then I said, maybe not. A pause. But it is what I do. No apology, no explanation, just fact. Dad looked at the check again, then at me. You think this settles everything? I shook my head slightly. No. A small pause. It settles my part. That was the difference. I was not trying to fix the entire situation, just my involvement in it. I stood up, slowly. No rush, no dramatic movement. Just done. Mom reached out again. Please. Her voice was barely there now. Do not do this. I looked at her. For a second, I almost softened. Almost. Then I remembered the phone call. Be useful for once. I said quietly, I am. The words came out calm, controlled. But this time, they meant something different. Not useful to them. Not in the way they understood. Useful to myself. To my life. To the version of me that no longer needed their approval to exist. I turned toward the door. Sienna said something behind me. I did not catch it. Or maybe I chose not to. My hand rested on the handle for a second. Then I opened it, stepped out into the hallway, closed the door behind me. The sound was soft, final. I walked past the receptionist, who looked up briefly, then back down at her screen. Outside, the air was cool, quiet. No noise from inside, no voices, just space. I stood there for a moment, breathing it in. Not relief, not triumph, just stillness. They would figure it out, or they would not. That was no longer my responsibility. Their finances, their reputation, their consequences, all of it belonged to them now. I got into my car and sat there for a second before starting the engine. Hands on the wheel. Steady. For the first time, I understood something clearly. I did not win. They did not lose. That was not what this was. This was balance. Finally. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for the moment someone in their family finally sees them clearly. I had stopped waiting. That was the difference. Silence is not absence. And truth, delivered quietly, lands harder than anything you could shout. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you are listening from.